first, I do want to thank Dr. Joseph Draper for putting this panel together, and thanks to all the panelists for engaging in this discussion. I also want to thank Dan Leahy, who actually came up with our title. And last but not least, I definitely want to thank Mary Lou Jackson for her leadership in organizing Heritage Week as a whole. A note about the structure of the discussion. Each panelist will introduce themselves in turn, and then each will take about 5 to 8 minutes to discuss their individual journeys to anti-racism. Then they'll engage in conversation with one another before opening the discussion up to questions and conversation from the audience for the latter part of our time. And if you're more comfortable with asking a question via chat, please do so. I'll be monitoring it and we'll make sure to bring questions forward. A little background. Our group met 4 times prior to this public discussion to dig into what it means for all of us as white identifying people to engage in anti-racist work. And I do want to highlight the fact that this panel is deliberately filled with white faces because it is important to acknowledge that anti-racist work and learning to be anti-racist is not solely the work of people of color. In fact, precisely the opposite. In preparing for this panel and in sketching the structure of it, I emailed everyone, each panelist introduces the self. What I meant to write was each panelist introduces themselves, but my glorious panelists took the typo at face value, and it ended up being central to the type of discussion we want to have today. We all bring and present particular aspects of the self to conversations about race. And it is important to be explicit about that because as white people, our bodies and experiences are socially framed as the norm. And so more often than not, we have the privilege of entering into conversations without explanation or context. With that said, the self I am bringing to this panel is the professional moderating self of the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. I'm also bringing my training as an American historian to the conversation and my scholarly work in theatrical performances on how bodies, specifically African-American bodies, are represented on the stage. I also bring the self of someone who was raised in the state of Maine, which is a very white state, and thus I had a lot of learning to do regarding my self-education as it relates to racism. And now I would like to turn it over to each of the panelists and ask that they introduce their specific selves. I'll start with Joseph, I think. Joe, you're muted.
You think after 10 months I'd know that?
No, it's okay.
Thank you, Kate. And I'd also like to thank Mary Lou and our panelists, also Dan and Audrey Grace for helping select the panel. So it's been a wonderful journey, brief as it is. My name is Joseph Draper, and I'm Associate Professor of Ethics and Religious Studies. And I'm the chair of the Department of Humanities here at Regis, and I've been here, this is my 14th year.
Becky.
First, let me say that it is an absolute amazing opportunity to have this ongoing conversation. I have learned so much and will continue to learn from my colleagues, from the other panelists, and from my students. And I'm really grateful to be here at Regis, a truly, truly caring institution. So I'm Becky DesRoches. I teach psychology, but moonlight in several other departments. I do tend to show up as needed for the music department, as you saw in that. Not enough students wanted solos. So, and I realized this is my 10th spring at Regis. I started as an adjunct and quickly learned that Regis can become a home, a family, as well as a place to work.
Jen.
Hi, I'm Jen Potts. I'm an assistant professor of humanities. I teach in both Department of Humanities as well as School of Communication because I'm also a filmmaker. But I'm here today not as just a faculty member, but just as a human being who's walked on this earth for 50, just turned 50 years, and continue to be part of this journey towards anti-racism.
And finally, ending with Kevin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kevin Henze, an assistant professor in the School of Health Sciences graduate counseling programs. And I believe this is my third, maybe my fourth year at Regis. And it's a true delight to be here. And as noted, having had the opportunity to talk with my fellow colleagues for almost 4 hours before today, really appreciating the opportunity and maybe how rare an opportunity it is for white folks to get together and have substantive, connected discussions about our own racial identity journeys. So I'm really so pleased to be here today.
And Kevin, since we ended with you, let's start with you on the journey, and then we'll, if I remember the reverse order, we'll go that direction for the way back.
Sure. You know, this is a really a topic that's really close to my heart, whiteness and anti-racism. And, you know, I think my parents, my father is still alive, my siblings have been surprised by my focus on anti-racism. And part of that comes out of the fact that I was raised in Evansville, Indiana, which is a Midwestern city that is on the Ohio River. And I've shared in previous Regis forum, I believe, when I talked about white racial identity in the fall, I may have shared that Evansville is a very white city, at least my understanding of it. And I think that is one of the starting places for my own white racial identity development, was really a place of obliviousness, of not recognizing my own race and only recognizing race in Black, Indigenous, people of color, who were really few and far between in my academics, all the way up until grad school. One of the challenges I have found about talking about whiteness, my own whiteness, racial identity, is I find that it's very, very, very easy for me to talk about it in academic terms. It's really easy for me to slide into discussions about white racial identity theory. And part of the reason why that's easy for me is because my own consciousness about whiteness occurred in graduate school when I was working with Dr. Janet Helms, who's one of the seminal scholars in counseling psychology, who's known as sort of a founding scholar in white racial identity theory. And I mentioned that the ease to be sort of academic about it, because I've learned over time that it's equally important to be able to sit with the emotions that arise when considering my own whiteness. And the emotional journey for white racial consciousness for me has been the harder journey. The intellectual journey has been challenging, but not as hard. So some of the experiences I've had that really embody the challenges and the emotional journey with whiteness is coming to terms with my own racism, my own ongoing experience with noticing the way that the legacy burden of whiteness and white socialization, how that continues to show up in my life. Noticing how it can be easy to slip into obliviousness again. And I must admit that that's a hard thing for me to admit, particularly in a public forum that's recorded, because I can appreciate that one of the biggest barriers to talking about whiteness and race is this idea that Robin DiAngelo talks about in her book, White Fragility, that to be racist is to be bad. And that the only people who are racist are bad people. And it's this sort of good, bad binary. And the challenge with that I've discovered in myself is that when I fall into that belief, I feel shameful about myself. And I think one of the things I've discovered over the years, and I wish I could tell you that I no longer experience shame related to aspects of whiteness. But one of the things I've discovered is that shame is a disconnecting emotion. It actually pushes me out of connection. The things I feel shameful about, I don't want to talk about because they're vulnerable. And not very few of us like to lean into our vulnerabilities. And one of the greatest gifts, I'm wanting to be respectful of the time here. So Kate, give me a boot if I start getting too close. One of the greatest gifts I've had in recent years is twofold. One, it really has been a blessing to be able to draw a connection between my work, my academic work in white racial identity, and my work as a counseling psychologist who understands how to work with emotions like shame. And one of the pieces I want to make a connection to is how important it is for white folks to develop shame resiliency. Some of us in this online forum probably know the work of Brené Brown, who's written extensively about shame. And in my work outside of Regis, I have some other work I do. I run a shame resiliency group with folks who are in recovery from addiction, dual diagnosis issues. And one of the way she defines shame is this unbearable feeling or belief that I am flawed and therefore unworthy of connection or belonging. And my fervent belief is that for us to actually move towards true anti-racist action, white folks need to cultivate shame resiliency. We have to. If we do not cultivate our own personal shame resiliency around racism and whiteness, shame will keep white folks from engaging the work. And I think that's one of the other sort of aha sort of realizations I've had in recent days. I have some other things I'd like to share, but I want to hear from other panelists as well. So with that, I will place a bookmark in my journey.
Thank you, Kevin. And just for everyone, my
laptop suddenly decided to go insane. So it is still might be recording me, but I can't see anything. So I'm using my phone to make sure this all goes through properly. So I'm going to pass things along to, I think in reverse order, we're back to Jen to talk about her journey.
Okay, so unlike Kevin, I don't have a lot of academic language when I discuss racism and my journey. And it's been a pleasure actually listening to him and some of the ways he frames things. I'm gonna learn how to have a little bit of that language, that because I find some of it's really spot on and puts a name on something that I haven't been able to yet name. So, but what I did do, because anyone who knows me knows that I tend to be extremely honest, as my husband calls me, brutally honest. I actually prepared something, and I'm going to read what I prepared because I wanted to stay on track, and I wanted my honesty to be well thought out instead of something that all of you had to palate later. So, my journey. I was born in 1970, and like I said, just turned 50. And I was born to parents who were both civil rights activists in the 60s. And as a child, I really didn't witness the racism that happens behind closed doors in white spaces. And as far as I was concerned, racism really didn't exist. It was a sort of comfortable myth that allowed me to happily live in a bubble of privilege as a child. When I was in middle school, I moved to London, and it was in London that I first experienced overt racism in white spaces, particularly at my local pub, because yes, teenagers hang out in local pubs in London. I would get so angry when someone would make a racist joke or a comment. And I can remember telling people that, racism didn't exist in the States, that this was a British issue. And all the Brits would laugh at me like they knew some secret that I didn't know. Luckily, while I was in London, I also attended an international high school with 120 kids from 30 different countries. My best friends were Danish and Basque and Yemenis and Syrian and Lebanese. And the school opened my mind to sort of a huge variety of culture and language and just a totally different world. Then 4 days before my senior year in high school, I moved back to Northern Virginia. And I was plunked down in the middle of a public high school. I can remember on the first day of school, arriving in the parking lot, I didn't have a license, so my mother had to drive me, which was a totally different world too for me. I had a lot of freedom in London. And I saw trucks with Confederate flags on the back of the trucks. And I really didn't fully understand what that meant. As we all know, American history is never taught the way it needs to be taught in truth. And a lot of the truth sort of slips between the cracks. But I could feel the racial tension. I could feel that I had landed in a totally different world. And it really didn't hit me fully until I started dating a boy who was brown. And I was met with a lot of hostility and a lot of othering happened. I was also sounded British, so there was a lot of othering happening with me anyway. And it was a really big year for me, a year of growth, a year of realizing that racism was alive and well in the United States, and that I couldn't pretend any longer. I couldn't stay in my bubble anymore. I had to actually live in this new world, in this new reality. So years later, when I decided to raise, my husband and I decided to raise our 4 young children, we looked at demographics, where we were going to live. We didn't want to live in a white city. Very hard to find a place that's racially diverse sometimes in Massachusetts. And we chose a city that was both racially and economically diverse. We thought we did everything right. Like we, sent our kids to public school, enrolled them in bilingual programs, read them with books about families that didn't look like us. We had good friends who we hung out with all the time who didn't look like us. I mean, we were really like super parents. At least we thought we were super parents. And the truth is, we have super children, so they turned out okay. But then when my kids were sort of in elementary school, I was teaching free dance lessons to students, children in the community. And one of the girls in my class was removed from her home and put in emergency placement in my home. And that emergency placement turned into guardianship. And now 26, she'll be 26 this weekend, 26 years later, she's still my daughter. And raising a child that is not biologically your child is eye-opening and can make you feel really insufficient. But raising a child who has a different racial identity as you is something I just wasn't prepared for. And it was not until many years later that I really understood how unprepared I was. Thank goodness she is okay. But we have a lot of talking, a lot of stuff to dig through over the years. Before arriving at Regis almost 4 years ago, I've been here almost 4 years, same as you, Kevin. I think we came at the same time. I considered myself an activist. Like when I found myself in white spaces where white people participated in racist behavior, I always spoke up. I had a man fired from a McDonald's in upstate New York for racial slurs that he used because he thought that because I was white, that was okay. I remember being down in Florida with my husband's family, and they told racist jokes at the table, and I had words to say with them before I disgustedly left the room. I alienated every white person you can possibly imagine. I was like a bull in a china shop, and I was not having none of this overt nasty racism, overt being a key word here. Then when I came to Regis, I became really good friends with Michelle Cromwell, who was the Chief Diversity Officer at the time. And we had some of the most eye-opening conversations I've ever had about race. We talked about what it was like for me to raise sons and what her experience was raising a son in America, and the fear that she had raising her son in America, and how as he got older, that fear just got worse and worse. And I was with her one day when her alarm went off in her house, and she could see her house on her phone. It was very high tech. I don't have that kind of high tech in my house, but she could see her house on her phone, and she could see that her son was coming to the house because he also got the alert on her phone, and she had just signed for the police to arrive at her house. And it was just the most horrific experience I've ever lived through, because she thought the police were going to kill her son. And I really began to see a world that I hadn't seen before. And it was a world that wasn't overt. It was a world that was subtle. I started to read everything I could get my hands on. I read Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race. I read White Fragility way too many times to even admit. And then, started to see my own biases and my own racism and how I was part of this system and this problem. I don't know if I felt shame necessarily, but I think we all feel shame at certain points in this, but I was angry. And I was angry that I was part of the problem and knew that I had to become part of the solution. And one day Michelle said to me, she asked me this question, and it haunts me to this day. I still have to live with, I don't have an answer for it. She said, if I was ever had the opportunity to give up my privilege so that people of color could rise to the top, would I do it? Would I give up my privilege? And I realized that I don't even know how to answer that. I don't know if any human being could do that, right? The truth is, being white allows me to choose when I want to discuss racism. I get to choose when I want to engage. I get to advance in my job and climb the economic ladder and claim that my success is a result of my hard work. But the truth is that I had to face that I'm part of this exclusive club. I'm part of the white club. And whether I chose to be this part of this or not, I also didn't choose to walk away from it entirely. And because I am part of that club, I'm part of the problem. So 2 years ago, I was in the Caribbean and having dinner with my husband's colleagues, and I decided to talk about race because that's what I do. I like to have conversations with white people about race. And I said that race was a social construct. And I was talking to a scientist who pushed back and said, no, it's a biological construct. It's biological. Race is biological. And we got in this huge, horrible debate. And I realized at the end of the day, like I lost sleep for weeks over this, especially because it was my husband's and colleagues. But I realized I didn't know enough. I still didn't know enough. Yeah, I understood my whiteness sort of, but I didn't really know enough. So then I started reading and reading and reading and reading because I was never going to end up in that situation again. I had decided, because that's my ego rising up there. And the two books that I read, and if anybody has not read these books, I cannot even recommend them enough. Malcolm X's autobiography and Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, the two of the most eye-opening books I have ever read. And when I was reading Malcolm X's autobiography, he referred to white liberals like me as a fox in sheep's clothing. He said, at least the overt racists, you know who they are. You can see them, you can avoid them, but you know who they are. But it's the white liberals, the ones that say that they are on your side, that are out marching in civil rights movements, pretending to be allies, but still living in white neighborhoods, going to white churches, turning a blind eye when inequality happens, right? I started to actually realize how much I was still really much a part of the problem. And so my journey to understand and combat racism over the past 4 years has been rocky. And it's a journey that I know I'm going to spend my entire life on. I have said things, the wrong things. I've had to own them. I've alienated so many white people. I even applied to a position on our diversity council in my city. And during my interview, I asked them why the chief diversity officer made half of what all the other executive positions made in the city that I live in. I asked them what they were doing to restructure their policing system and the problems that we've seen with police brutality in the system. I asked them all the questions that they really did not want to hear. And needless to say, I'm not serving on the diversity council because maybe I'm just a little too vocal. Maybe I'm just a little too much of a bull in a china shop to this day. But I do think that I have to question these things. And this journey has not made me popular, and it won't make me popular probably ever. But I have to face the truth about my own whiteness and the truth that I have lived in this bubble of privilege my entire life. Hold on, I don't want to go off track. It allows me to decide whether or not I'm going to get up every day and fight this fight. And I could decide that it's bigger than me, or that I don't want to do this, or that it's exhausting, or I just don't have the energy to keep going or keep doing this. And I can go back to bed and ignore it, or I can pretend that it just doesn't exist because I'm white. And every time I choose to live in that comfort of whiteness, I realize I'm participating in that social system of racism. And so I realize that this journey is never going to end in my lifetime. I also realized that by choosing to intentionally and actively disrupt racism, I have to be willing to fail. I have to be willing to grow, to accept that I have biases, and to work on changing myself first. It's that mask thing, like you're in the plane that starts going down. You don't put the mask on the kid first, you put the mask on yourself first, then you put it on the kid. So the work needs to happen on me first. And then I know that I will be more prepared, the more work I do on myself, to contribute to changing the way we function in our society and disrupting our systems. Hold on, I'm just going to finish this. I don't know if I've gone over. Kate hasn't yelled at me yet.
I chat yelled, but that's okay.
Okay, I will finish up. At the end of the day, racism is a white problem, and it plagued us for hundreds of years. It's affected the lives of all Americans of all skin colors, all backgrounds. It's a cancer at the core of our society. And quite frankly, I think white souls are also at stake. I know that I can use my privilege to dismantle systems and make changes, but I also know that this can feed my ego with the satisfaction of feeling like a savior rather than the one who needs saving. What I do know, however, is that this is a journey I have to take, a journey we should all take if we're ever going to cure this disease that kills bodies, souls, and eliminates the possibility of us ever living in peace within our own country. I'm staying on this journey until I can honestly answer yes to Michelle's question. And today I'm going to ask you to think about that question. Would you be willing to give up your privilege if it meant that people of color would rise? Thank you. Sorry I went over.
And we'll turn it over to Becky.
Excellent. My high school yearbook quote was so much left to know, and I'm on the road to find out. And that's true today, and it was true a long time ago when I graduated from high school. So I too prepared some remarks, and I'm keeping sort of this first half. My anti-racist self has lots of angles and lots of components, and my academic self is fused with my personal stories. So I'm gonna try to keep my remarks kind of academic and personal, and then I have a number of stories that hopefully I'll eventually share as well. So the academic idea, and I appreciate that Kevin said it's easy to slip into that, but it's also really good to keep going back and forth. So there's the academic of how our brains perceive and construct race, and our own personal journey, all the small and large interactions and experiences that led us to where we are and how we are today. So I hope that a few ideas I share about myself shed light on your journey. And we have a lot of different people here, and raise questions for you. So how can you move authentically along the path of thought and action that is anti-racist? Where is there discomfort that you need to lean into? Where are areas for growth? And what are some successes you might have had? So how do we help to dissolve lies that have been told for generations and internalized? And these are all worth reflecting on. So I was raised in Center City, Philadelphia. I grew up with a mom and dad who truly embraced different cultures, languages, religions, and modeled that for me. Total privilege. And I use that word intentionally. I had a very privileged upbringing, lots of opportunity for understanding and greeting people of different races and religions. Though many close friends were and are dark-skinned, I believe myself to be open and loving with many races, many genders. And I still think the word to describe myself is in some regards, but hopefully more was, oblivious. Kevin used that word also. I'm not proud of it, but I didn't have to think about the world in the same way as my friends of color did and do. So we'll get to some of the specific stories, but I want to talk about my training, which is in cognitive developmental psychology. I'm interested in the mind, thoughts, feelings, emotions, and of course, the behavior that arises from that complexity. I tend to think about things as they grow and develop over time. The brain is a pattern recognizing machine, and often the shortcuts our brain takes are great. I'm glad I don't have to think about driving, but they can and they do lead us astray over and over again. I try to incorporate race and gender issues, or at the very least, perception, perspective taking, and empathy into all my classes. I have several fundamental belief systems about growth. It can be uncomfortable and painful, going to the gym and working out until you're in pain, but it's also natural and joyful and playful and fun. And let's, use both of those aspects of it. So I believe the developmental journey is optimized when we move away from egocentric thinking, I, me, mine, to a broader notion of we. And each of us can do that from wherever we are right now, regardless of your background and training, your race, your gender, whether you're a 4-year-old, not many on this talk, or a 90-year-old. This is important work for all human beings and not just those who are marginalized. We, capital W, capital E, all benefit from a broader perspective, wisdom, understanding, and clarity. So the research on this is clear in the realm of positive psychology. When equity and justice are valued, we promote well-being on all sides. When we dehumanize another, we dehumanize ourselves. So whether you're in a group that's getting stepped on or you benefit from a lot of privilege, it's important to think about and take action. This starts with awareness. Pay attention. Pay, that's an active process, something you give. Developmentally, we increase our knowledge over the course of our lives in many ways. So socially, a baby, your social sphere starts out limited and it expands over time. Your family, your daycare, your high school, your college. So a lifelong question to pursue is, how do we make a wider circle to care about all humans, not just the ones who look like or think the way we do? And this is so aligned with the Sisters of St. Joseph and what we do at Regis. The heritage of our school, our dear neighbor. Everyone matters, everyone is welcome. So as a psychologist, I've known the term implicit bias for a while now. It's become popular. I'm glad we as a society are more educated about it. Admitting that we are flawed and biased is huge, and we all are. But the goal is not to eliminate bias, but the negative effects of our biased beliefs. And I think we could talk about it differently. The buzzword implicit bias gets us off the hook. A subtle change in wording to unexamined bias gives us ownership and responsibility to be part of the process and the solution. So, sure, sometimes we're unaware of our assumptions and biases. They may be deeply ingrained and enculturated, and it's still our responsibility to look at them and bring them to light. So being an anti-racist, or at least moving the needle in that direction, is important along several fronts. For us individually and of course collectively. And we all have slightly different journeys. No one person can or should try to cover it all. It's nonlinear, it's cyclical. We will all be called to different aspects of the fight at different times. So right now I'm back to focusing on education and awareness, breaking down the denial, calling it out. There are many defense mechanisms our mind uses when it's uncomfortable. Denial is an immature one. You're not even owning it. There is systemic racism in our society, in our school, in our hearts, and we are improving. So noticing, waking up is an important first step and middle step and later step in the journey. It's a journey and it's lifelong. So this is very uncomfortable at times, and there's value in that discomfort, because it draws attention to something is not quite right. I am uncomfortable with being on this panel, and I'm really happy to be here, and I can hold both those things. Also uncomfortable with the notion of woke. Could spend some time looking at that word, but from a linguistic perspective, it makes it so binary. I think it would be better to think of it as an act of waking. Changing the wording changes our thought process around it. And this metaphor is really useful. There's deep sleep, there's active alert wake, and there are fundamentally different states in between. REM dreaming, awake attending, daydreaming, not paying attention. We don't stay in one state. And you probably have been in more than one in the last 5 minutes, hopefully mostly active attention. But all right, so to wrap it up, my intention is to educate myself and others and to try to do no harm in the process. And I won't succeed in that. I will step on toes if I'm being active. I hope my students, my friends, my colleagues call me out when I fail, because that's where the learning is. And the heritage of Regis tells me it's my personal responsibility to develop my muscles for emotional intelligence, for compassion, to be actively anti-racist. There's vulnerability there and room for growth. Let's hear it for growth. And I yield the floor.
Thank you, Becky. And we're going to go back to our beginning with Joseph.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this very brief because I do want to leave time for audience questions and comments. So I'm going to scrap what I was my prepared talk. And I just want to say two things. One is I feel very grateful to work and serve at Regis College. I think the summer dialogue where we listened to our students and staff and faculty of color was extraordinarily powerful. I want to applaud our president and administration for being so open to just listening and not intruding thoughts into that conversation. I want to thank them for the goals that we have, particularly as it relates to faculty 1, 3, and 5 for faculty development and for course design, to be explicitly aware of racial bias, to specifically attend to our goals to address these issues. So that's the first thing. And I'm very proud to work in many institutions, including Regis in my 15 years. This is not our first go at this. This is a very promising one, I will say that. And second and finally, I learned something from both the Sisters of St. Joseph. I went to a CSJ elementary school, and here I am at a CSJ college. And I was also went to a Jesuit high school, Jesuit undergraduate school, and then BC. And one of the things that I attribute to my Catholic learning, and this relates to what Kevin Henze said about shame resilience. Even though there's a lot of shame in your Catholic upbringing, there's a lot of shame resilience. And one of them was educators who rejoiced at a student coming to know that they didn't know something. Not rejoicing in that they came to know something, but that they became aware of their ignorance. Because the educators that I had knew that that is the starting point to learn, the known unknown. When you know that you don't know, you suddenly begin to wonder, and wonder provides the mental calories for making internal change. And I admire my CSJ and Jesuit educators for that, and it's a form of not being shameful about ignorance. And I think white normativity is a massive unknown, where many white people like myself spent much of my life not knowing that I didn't know that that was a thing. Not knowing that I didn't know that racial bias and residual racism that follows even becoming an anti-racist, there is still residual racism if you grew up as I did, and as our panelists shared, in a very white atmosphere, you could not have escaped it. But coming to be aware of that is the starting point to wonder. And I'm very grateful for my upbringing, and I think that's, I'm grateful for the panel. It's been an extraordinary experience to be with you all, Kevin and Jen and Becky. And I'm gonna end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm seeing the chat, which is very canny, that Karen Miranda noted, and this is something that we talked about as a group, around shame can lead to defensiveness, and defensiveness creates a barrier to growing. And I think that, you know, as each of these conversational threads picked up on the notion of growth, of shame, of ego, of how kind of trying to decenter whiteness leads to sense of these instability, but then, you know, maybe a better grounding in who we are and what we can be, to sort of spin off a little bit of Becky holding two things at the same time, I think is really important. And so now I want to open it up to the group for questions, reflections. We don't have tons of time, but I think we have some time for the audience to respond, or for panelists to pick up threads from each other that they want to pick up. And again, I'm operating off my phone because my laptop, though apparently is still showing my face and I'm showing up twice, is a weird squiggly thing. And so like, chat is a little tricky on my phone, but I will try to, if people put in the chat, I will pick up on it.
May I speak?
Of course. Yes, please.
I'll be honest. I did not like this panel. I do not think this is actually very helpful. Oh, most of this seemed like a lot of navel gazing type stuff. It seems to me it would be far more productive to do stuff like go over institutions with a fine-tooth comb to root out systemic bias, surgically remove it from the body politic and deal with that first. That seems a much more pressing issue. Stuff like dealing with zoning law, so the people we're talking about helping can actually get decent housing, seems a lot more important.
No, thank you. Kevin, do you maybe want to speak to that? Because I know
Yeah,
you've done
no, I'm
work.
unable to see I can see the member who just spoke, but his email's showing up, not his whole name.
Joshua, my name's Josh.
Josh, thank you, Joshua. I always like to refer to people by their name. I really do appreciate that comment. I think that this is one of the fundamental paradoxes of anti-racism, is that on the one hand, there are real casualties to racism, people of color, the injustice you mentioned, I think very astutely mentioned, zoning laws, inequities in pay, inequities in housing. This actually is why oftentimes the work of developing white racial identity is best done in white affinity groups, because we need both. We need the focus on removing systemic racism, identifying laws, policies. I'm thinking about the most recent election, I won't go there, but thinking about all the various systems that are in place that perpetuate racism, and actually changing policies and laws and practices to reverse, to undo that. But as a psychologist, I just have to sort of respectfully disagree that well, you didn't say this, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, Joshua. I also think it's important that each person has an opportunity to consider their own sort of racial journey. One of the things that I think, the last thing I'll say about this is, I think another trap that happens in anti-racism work is that there are some white folks, for various reasons, they get to a place of awareness and they are really committed to action. Jen mentioned this in her talk, like the sense of like, I'm calling people out, I'm taking names, we're making change, we're calling the city council out on their policies that are inequitable and all of that. That work needs to happen. But what happens is that white folks who are not in that place, when they see that, it basically freaks them out. And what they do oftentimes is simply run away. And that's how white privilege works. That's how the institution perpetuates itself, because people are on these extremes. So we do need to have a place where people who have different places in their journey can come together with a sense of understanding and compassion to try to move the dialogue forward among white people. And I'm very clear about that. I don't think that that is necessarily helpful to happen in cross-racial settings, for many reasons, including the fact that oftentimes this type of introspective, self-reflective conversation can be traumatizing at times for Black, Indigenous people of color to bear witness to, because their lived experience with racism is a life or death matter. So to bear witness to white folks having this sort of introspective conversation, frankly, it can be traumatizing. So I appreciate the comment and wanted to just add a little input from my perspective.
And I think your metaphor of surgically remove is apt and wonderful. And I think if it's so systemic that it's in the blood, you can't necessarily cut that out. And so there are lots of, we're all on our slightly different journey, and there's lots of solutions, and all of these need to be done kind of at the same time. So, as a developmental psychologist, when lead gets into your blood, if you're a pregnant mom or a young child, it affects your brain development. And so, yeah, we want to get rid of that. And there are lots and lots of different ways to be called to figuring out how, why does poverty affect brain development? And there's some obvious things like lead exposure early on. So I like the way you're thinking about it, and I'll let other panelists speak to it too.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. And Joshua, thank you for your question. In two
Oh yes,
classes.
also long time no see, Professor Draper.
Yes, good to see you. And you've never lacked courage in asking questions, so this is wonderful. I would like to add a historical perspective, and I know that you demonstrated historical consciousness in the comments that you make in my classes. One of the broader problems here is, as Becky and Jen and Kevin have pointed out, it might be a problem with liberal activists, in that the very abolitionists who sought to dismantle slavery, Frederick Douglass spoke to them in 1852, and you could look this up, it's online for free, What is the 4th of July to a Slave? He was speaking to a white abolitionist audience that he knew, many of whom were racist. And as it happened historically, slavery was dismantled. And it was very shortly replaced with segregation and Jim Crow. So somehow the activists that wanted the dismantling, the surgical removal of this terrible institution allowed racism to retrue itself historically. Then the civil rights movement comes exactly 100 years later with Thurgood Marshall, and then a decade later with Martin Luther King Jr. And MLK knew that many of the white activists who supported the desegregation were also racist, polite racist, he called them. And sure enough, as soon as the civil rights movement began to subside, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965. Mass incarceration started almost immediately after, and millions, there were more Black men in prison than there were slaves in 1850. And that's chronicled by Michelle Alexander and Brian Stevenson. So the problem is that once civil rights ended, we liberals sat out the retruing of the racist institution. And that's the fear today, that removing and firing and correcting, which does have to happen, as Kevin and Becky eloquently said, we also have to be vigilant that when chokeholds are barred after the BLM movement, if it subsides, which I hope it doesn't soon, that we should anticipate and not sit out another attempt by the system to retrue itself.
Thank you. And amazingly enough, we are coming up at time, but I want to end on a really, really smart question that came a little earlier in the chat, because I think it's a good action question to open up to the panel. This is from Alicia, who asks, as this panel is a focus on the white persons and their place within racism. And as someone who's sort of at the wonder portion of educating themselves, which is a wonderful phrase, how can one start to recognize and deal with those intense feelings of shame and denial? And then I would push that question forward and then maybe take some of the action steps that Josh is referencing. So maybe briefly we can close on that education and action for the panel. That would be great. So maybe start with Jen, because she hasn't had a chance to reflect.
Yeah, so I stepped out of it because I could see the time and I saw this question coming in. I think just quickly that I love what Joshua said, because I'm that person who just wants to surgically remove it from every system that I see and everywhere I go. But I realize it's in my system too. And I need to surgically remove it from myself, and we all need to recognize it within ourselves to deal with it within ourselves, as well as the systems that we need to change. I would say that the only way to move past the feelings of shame is to constantly face that. And I'm not, Kevin probably has a really good answer for this. I know you do, Kevin, but to face it. And, you know, you get that, like, anytime you want to do something that's kind of scary and you have that like little devil on your shoulder, I'm a filmmaker, a storyteller, who's telling you can't do it and you're bad and you're never going to make it. And you have to deal with your shame the same way. You have to face it. You have to tell it to go away. And you have to look for ways to move forward. And I think educating yourself, like constantly taking in as much information as you can to understand the breadth of this subject, to internalize as much information as you can help you to face that shame, because shame is just a way to keep us from changing, from growing, from becoming the better versions of ourselves. So that's my answer. I talked enough.
Any quick 30-second responses from our other panelists?
I'm happy just to add that, you know, from a white fragility perspective, the work of Robin DiAngelo, she talks about how each of white people need to interrupt their racist patterns and transform their own white racial paradigm. And we do this by focusing on emotions, behaviors, claims we make. And some of the emotions that can help in that process is gratitude, compassion, humility, the behaviors, the capacity to apologize, the capacity to engage, to reflect, the capacity to listen. Also, the ability to reach out and talk with other white people who can be there to help process experiences of racial stress, instead of running away from racially stressful events and maybe falling into obliviousness again. Having an accountability group that one we can go to and talk about what's been happening. If we have a broken relationship, you know, doing our best, and it's related to racism, doing our best to own the racism instead of making excuses. And I think also it's been mentioned, you know, calling people out, calling white people out. I like to think about it as calling folks in to a conversation, calling folks into a dialogue, and particularly if there's someone, a white person who's, you know, acting or talking in a way that's suggesting a racial ignorance or arrogance, and how can we call people into a more thoughtful conversation? And honestly, I think that's part of what we were trying to model today. And it's just been a real privilege to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. And Becky, since you started the conversation on wonder, maybe end on your thoughts before letting people go, and wanting to be respectful of everyone's time.
Excellent. Yeah, and I do think, so when you're curious about things, it does take some of the sting out of the negative emotions. And so some of the suffering is caused by trying not to see something that you know is there. And so sort of in the psychological realm, bringing it to light and looking at it and leaning into it. Now, it depends. If it's truly a traumatic experience, then you need professional guidance in leaning in. But in general, if you're kind of curious, you know, why did I respond defensively to that? And leaning into, why did I get freaked out when they told me I was racist, instead of, yeah, I have some biases there. Let's look at that. And so curiosity, I think, is often a great antidote to a lot of the questions that come up as we discuss very complicated emotions, and motivation is never just one thing. And so there are layers to it, and peeling that away and seeing it authentically and really leaning in, I think, is the best way I can say.
We want to thank everyone for coming and with your smart questions in the chat and for the kind of really holding the panel accountable in some really important ways. Very much appreciate all the panelists for their insight. I so much loved working with you over the past few weeks, and I hope we can continue the conversations in all sorts of different ways, both the sort of navel gazing, but also the surgical strikes, you know, in our curriculum, in our institution, and outside of Regis as well. I think that's all very important work across the board. So with that, want to bid everyone a really great night, and have a great rest of your evening, now that it's still sunny out. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. That was